thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And apologies for speaking in English. I will try to keep it slow so that it will be more easy to translate. Otherwise, please feel free to stop me. The theme that I was invited to talk about is about port cities, and you've already heard Sabah discuss this before. So I hope I will be able to add some elements in. Now, my fascination with port cities and port city territories has been for quite some time about three aspects. For one, I think that we have to look into port city territories as a larger spatial grouping. What I mean with that, a port always depends on the cities that it's connected to, on the landscapes around it. Many of the contemporary ports have their biggest problem in the hinterland, where you see the development of dry ports, where big infrastructures have to reach, while also crossing cities. And so the spaces that the port needs compete with those spaces that the cities need. And you can discuss, for example, the question of logistics in competition to logistics of care when mothers or parents get their children to school. A second question that I'm interested in is the fact that ports have long attracted people and goods and industry. So they have a long history of helping urban development come about. But at the same time, they need the cities, they serve cities, and yet they also compete with them. And with all of that, I would say there is a certain culture of port city territories, because other cities, capital cities, cultural cities, university cities, you name it, they don't have necessarily the same, or they don't have the intersection between water and land, because the investments in water to create a port are usually very expensive and very long-lasting. So with that said, I would like to take you along on a journey through the presentation to look at the long-term, multi-scalar, culture-led developments of port city territories. And that is in line with the research group that we've built in the three universities, Delft, Leiden, and Erasmus. And this research group is called Port City Futures. Now, just starting with my hometown and my own phone in this case, you would see the kind of pictures I often take. And what I'm hinting at here is to say there's a certain mindscape, there's a certain awareness of water, of ports, of shipping. At least that's what my telephone seems to suggest, because here you see the River Elbe, and here you see the highest numbers of pictures on my phone. So I kept on taking pictures either in the vicinity of the port or alongside the River Elbe. So, and I'm inviting you all to do something similar. Check out where is your your maritime mindset, as you can see it in your phone. And when I zoom in, you can see that the number of pictures keeps on increasing in the vicinity of water. Now, what kind of pictures would these then be? On the one hand, you can already see here that is a mindset of coming into the city by car and seeing one of the ports that you are actually crossing as you come from the south to Hamburg. On the other hand, and this is a bit less easy to see from the car when you enter the city, historic sites like the so-called Speicherstadt, which is the former warehouse district where coffee and carpets and spices were traditionally stored and transformed. Hamburg has long been a port that relied on free trade, so they had an agreement that goods entering the port were not taxed as long as they didn't enter the city. So products came into the port, were transformed, and sent out again without any payment of taxes. Now, this Speicherstadt is a whole little district in itself. It had its own spaces where you could trade, its own little restaurants, coffee shops today. Now, having this kind of little ecosystem in itself makes ports appear as something unique. You have to have a certain mindset, which I've been calling a maritime mindset, to actually engage with the port. You need to know what's going on in the port in order to understand it and also support it. Because if this has been the historical development of connecting port and city, we have often lost understanding of it, as we can no longer enter the ports where there are only cranes and containers. They're no longer touchable and visible. On top of that, ports have a lot of negative externalities. Rotterdam may well be the biggest port in Europe, but it's also the most polluting one, obviously, you could say. But what we need to understand, in my opinion, is that the ports they serve us, they are needed. We need them to get the goods as long as we want to buy food and clothes and whatever from other parts of the world. We have to accept that ports exist. At the same time, we have to make sure that the negative externalities of ports do not too much affect, or that there's at least some sort of balance with the positive effects that a port is having. And why this is important, and I'm showing you here the pollution level at a bad day in the area of Rotterdam. I think you can easily recognize the port itself with its contour, which is related to the port, to the city, but reaching out for some 40 kilometers. Now, the port and the pollution in it are not limited by the fences that provide the contours of the port. That wouldn't be possible. We can't keep water or air in a location. What we see here is that both shipping on the sea has a polluting effect that blows, in this case, inland, and this adds on to the industries of the port and the pollution created by the city. This affects anybody living in the vicinity on land, on sea and on land. And this is why I'm talking about the port city territory and the effect that port and shipping has not only on the cities, but also on the entire area around it, because they are competing. I've tried to visualize this approach by calling it a port cityscape in line with Henri Lefebvre, and arguing that we have one spatial continuity that crosses from sea to land, its interpretation and reflection, and the way that we actually represent it. So this spatial continuity starts with the ship. I mean, it's often famously said, the ship shapes the port, shapes the city, shapes the hinterland. If the ships go bigger, if the cargo changes, we get different types of ports and cities. And that's also true for drilling platforms or for pipelines and for the port itself. Up to here, we are talking really about global structures. These ships and ports are everywhere more or less the same. However, on the land side, we would see a different story. We would see headquarters that are often embedded in local conditions. In a country like France, you will have the headquarters, say, in Paris, whereas the ports are at the edges of the country, in Marseille, in Dunkirk, or Le Havre. So these relationships are not necessarily continuous. And similarly, the structures in which shipping invests, the highways, the dry ports in the hinterland, they are not a continuity necessarily of the port. In fact, in Europe, you might have the port of Rotterdam investing in the port of Duisburg in Germany and owning parts in it. So we have to somehow conceptualize the port city territory as something that is a networked, kind of fuzzy development, all depending and influenced by shipping. Now, how do we represent it? So this mindset that then is generated through publications, through paintings, through social media, is not necessarily the same that the one that is physically existing. So it might be nice to show the painting of a ship or the painting of a headquarter, but it's much less intriguing today to show a refinery, an oil tank, or pollution. So often the narrative that we tell about the port, the city, and the territory is not the same as the actual territory that is spatially shaped. And in order to rethink the balance between port, city, and territory and make sure that there are enough positive effects for one and the other, I think it's important to be aware of what the spatial impact is, but also the ways in which this space has been represented. So we've developed this idea of opportunities and challenges in port city territories, or certain dualities. And perhaps these dualities are the most visible when we think about logistics and livability. Whose logistic is more important? Is it about the transfer of goods to the hinterland or to the next city? Or is it about the kids playing in the neighborhood? You can think it the same story through economy and climate change. Why are we facilitating ports which are effectively bringing higher water levels into our cities and territories, increasing the threat rather than holding a level territory, holding up coastal defenses of moving further inland? Similarly, just to mention one more, this duality between local governance and global trade is, I think, particularly important in port cities, where the global container companies or the well, you know, the kind of businesses that are located in the port will have their global networks, their global links, while affecting local decisions. So you have one very strong player facing a relatively less strong player. Now, nonetheless, port cities have always had a certain fascination, and I would say they have a specific resilience. Why is that the case? Port cities are driven by the fact, and maybe this is not applying to just any city, but often we see, let's think about the medieval port cities in Europe, let's think of other cities. You have a certain need for collaboration and for different stakeholders to work together to facilitate the continuity of trade and exchange. And that means that different population groups have to work together. It also leads to a certain spirit in which you say, well, if I need to work together, I also need to facilitate the other partners in that exchange. So in that way, often legal systems, institutions have grown in port cities that facilitate interaction between different stakeholders. And you may very well say, well, there's also colonial port cities, there's exploitation, etc. That's all very much true, but still I do believe there's a certain awareness of the maritime that is unique and quite specific to port cities. Now, what we need now is a new form of planning that acknowledges this relationship between port and city to also be one that includes the entire territory, as I've been arguing from the beginning. So in the case of Rotterdam, for example, bringing in the greenhouses that are next to the port in the larger development, or bringing in new maritime services as the forms of creative industry for the future. And in that whole development, heritage needs to be integrated. And this heritage is not only historic buildings, it's also historic practices, institutions that are part of this larger context of making a port city a port city. So where to start? To start in understanding a port city, we have to look at the sea. The water is the main reason for port city territories for being different than other types of cities. So there, if you, just to give an example, you might see a religious building in a port city, and it might resemble the port cities next to it, but be completely different from the same religious buildings that are closer by, but on the inside the country. So I'm always looking for specificities of these port cities that make them unique. You could ask, for example, do port cities have a old university? And I would argue that in most port cities, the leaders decided to buy into or to buy for their students the access to other universities, whereas capital cities often had port universities very early on. Now, we've been trying to look into the history and the historic development of these port city territories, also from a comparative perspective. Now, to start with, we took the North Sea with London, Rotterdam, and Hamburg, and looked at the growth of the city, of the port city territory in time, taking the spread of the port of Rotterdam as kind of the point of departure for understanding this territory. Now, you might very well say the territory is much larger. We probably are getting the ingredients for beer making deeper into the territory, or they're delivering more deeply. And ideally, this should be represented on a web page so that you can scale in and out. But for the making of a paper version, we have to have a shared growth or shared spread. Now, even at that scale, and even knowing that we could be doing it differently, we looked at those three cities to understand whether there are certain values that arise in each of these cities. Now, when we compare these three places, Rotterdam, Hamburg, and London, all of them at least 1,000 years old, we see three different patterns. So we see here their growth over time for each of them. Now, the port, the black area here, we identified in the case of Rotterdam that the port has been the reason why the city was created. The port has been expanding, growing to the west, and the city, or actually the cities, have followed. Such a big port depends largely on all of these cities around it, The Hague and Delft and Dordrecht and so on. In the case of Hamburg, we see a tandem. The port has been evolving together with the city in a balanced way. Since it's a city-state, the state has also been controlling the port. The port can't really go beyond the city borders. And so there's a certain need to find a balance. In the case of London, while the port in the 18th, 19th, 20th century was really the heart of the empire, by now the port has all but disappeared and has been pushed out into the larger territory. So we can be telling different stories, different narratives about the development of the port through time. But it's very tedious and it takes a lot of historic information to do this. So what we published a couple of years ago is then the Port City Atlas. And this atlas is a version of this analysis from a contemporary perspective. So the Port City Atlas is focused on Europe. It shows 100 European port city territories at the same scale, mapped with a specific methodology. Now, there are a couple of takeaways that I would like to briefly present to you. So for one, we see so we see all these ports along the coast of Europe, and it reminds us that Europe really had this coast. With European unification, we've often forgotten about the edges of the country. Instead, Europe has been building or promoting new highways between Berlin and Paris, or between Paris and Madrid, so inside the country rather than outside. We have thus started to identify via shipping routes the main entrance points into the continent, the ports, and have then crossed it with the major population centers. And from that analysis, we have looked at 4 seas, meaning the Baltic, the North, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean, and have chosen the 25 largest port city territories, so where the ports have the biggest throughput for each of the seas. So in terms of ranking, showing here the Baltic Sea map, we will see that these are the 25 leading ports in the Baltic and the cities associated with them. And I find it really important to look at it this way, because otherwise everyone will focus, let's say, on Rotterdam as the big port. But Rotterdam is very unique in many ways because it has this it is very accessible on flat land towards the German hinterland and the industrial areas. When we look at Scandinavia, we see much less density, much less infrastructure. So the relationship is very different. And it's important to point out how different these territories can actually be. Because what is important about port city territories is that they are to some degree always the same and always different, depending on local conditions, historically, politically, economically, socially. So for these 100 cities, we have then developed a spatial analysis that includes the port, the city, so the built-up area, the infrastructures, Natura 2000 sites, so protection sites, nature protection sites, shipping lines, and depth, but also places like World Heritage sites, universities, hospitals, and so on. And this gives us an idea that some places that are usually in an atlas presented only separately actually belong together. So these are two different countries, Sweden and Denmark, that these two ports are facing each other. And I would argue that they form one port city territory where water is in the middle and not just a border between two different locations. I'll show you very briefly a couple of other maps to just give an idea on how different these port city territories can look. I had started with showing you my hometown of Hamburg. You've seen me driving through the tunnel and going north. Well, this is the part of the port where you would reach, which has completely moved to the south side of the river, which allows on the north side of the river all kinds of viewpoints on the port while being far enough away from many of its polluting elements. So at the same scale, you can then see other major ports, and surprisingly Lübeck, which used to be very well known in Europe as the queen of the Hanseatic cities, and much bigger than Hamburg, is now, well, it's still quite a big port. It's still among the 25 biggest. But you can also see simply from the geography that the challenges are very different. If we talk about challenges of climate change, of accessibility, of depth of the sea, of access to hinterland, all of these really depend on the local conditions. And so in this case, in all of these 100 cities, we showed the waterway, the different types of goods and people that are being transported, but also elements like access to the main cities and the relief of the area. Now so far we have seen only very flat places, but if I were to show you one of the volcanic islands, you really have a lot of depth. Just a few more to get a sense of how different they are. Copenhagen, and you see, for example, that many of these port cities actually not only have one port, but they have multiple, often much smaller ports. So if we want to plan the future and think about a distribution of functions in relation to whatever urban elements take place behind it, it would be very good to take into account all these access points, and not to use any of them and put, let's say, big boxes like IKEA on it, but really to cherish the often long-term construction of transshipment in those kind of areas. And that becomes very clear in a place like Stockholm that is built on, well, on islands, for example, or Helsinki. Helsinki is interesting if you wanted to look at it, because also of it is facing the Estonia and the port of Tallinn, and while during the Cold War, those two were separated. Helsinki was the easternmost of the West European trading places, and now multiple challenges are occurring with the competition that is going on with Tallinn. Now, in this context, and I could tell you the similar stories for the Atlantic or for the Mediterranean Sea, with all its challenges. So, for example, all this mapping is based on open access data. And as you can see here, we don't have this data for Africa. So the 25 cities from the Mediterranean are only the ones that are in the European Union. But the methodology behind this mapping is something that can be replicated as long as data is available. And it shows us also the overlap between heritage sites and shipping. So for places like the Mediterranean or Northern Europe, where ships have been crossing for several thousand years, you will see that these biggest of the port city territories are also the places where most of the heritage sites exist. People have been going through Naples or Venice, Genoa for such a long time that every port expansion also has to take into account the shipwrecks, the antique shipwrecks here, or the heritage sites that have been built inland. Now, how we relate the ongoing major port with the challenges of the particular site and its history is perhaps most visible in the case of Venice, where the historic city of Venice sits in the lagoon. And in the lagoon, we also have the port of Marghera with all its challenges. So this question of modern working ports, their history and their integration with the city is one that is absolutely, well, it's very urgent to address, and it exists all around the world. Now, this is true. I've been showing you mostly the seaports, but this is also true for river ports. And I just wanted to switch to a city that we usually don't think about as a port city, which is Paris. Paris is actually a city that has grown thanks to shipping and trade. The motto of the city is about shipping. You can, once you start looking for it, you find emblems and icons on shipping throughout the city, including on the Louvre, the big former palace that you see here in the background. But what is happening in Paris, and I think you're aware of it because of the Olympics, is that people are returning to the river in novel ways. And that has implications also for shipping, and it has implications for how we see a port city territory in the first place. Because if I want to swim in the river, and that was not just a one-time thing for the Olympics, but it's something that Paris pursues and is currently actually building 3 swimming pools in the Seine, then I have to change other, what I would call values. So this is perhaps less evident for the seaport cities, where we already have, or it's just as evident, where we already have beaches and shipping and different activities, but it all comes together in port city territories on rivers even more urgently. So if I want to have all of these functions in the same place, and remember that many cities have used their rivers as sewage pipes, but we want to be swimming and kayaking in it. We want to eat food from it. We need protection. We want to have beauty, and we also have shipping. So we need to govern all of this in some kind of way by also protecting the heritage that we have. So in this way, you can say, if I really want to be swimming in the river, and swimming in the river becomes the main value that I'm working with, then I need to take care of my sewage, which was a big challenge for the Olympics. and I need to take care of shipping. So very concretely, it means that the shipping that is taking place in Paris and crossing the city, and these can be grains, it can be building materials, there's quite some traffic through the city, will have to go into a different arm of the city, will have to change speeds, will have to adapt, and can't be polluting in the same ways anymore. Those discussions have been taken into account, and I think here Paris really has a model character. I agree it's very small, but I do think it is the theme that we should be thinking about when we are talking port city territories. So the Javelbas port is a port in the 15th arrondissement in Paris. So it's really in the historic center where ships arrive to, well, for the goods that these two companies here are about. So they have created a fence that can close and open. So it will only close when transshipment takes place. And for the rest, it closes off the facility and people can walk back and forth here. This goes back to traditional ways of living with ports, which are ways where we had a multifunctional use of the space. And you can see that here it's also very high quality materials. So you have a public space that remains accessible for sitting, jogging, football playing, or whatever people want to do. And this is not only just one case or just for a price example. In fact, Paris is working on urban distribution through notably these key shipping via lightweight aluminum containers, small containers into the city at night. So IKEA customers will get their goods delivered via the water and then by electric vehicles into the city. So that's a very different story than the big boxes that are around many other cities. The big boxes are certainly somewhere also in France, but they've tried to keep them out of the center of the city. Similarly, other activities like the supermarkets will deliver via the water. And I do think that this is both the multifunctional use of a space, but also the multi-temporal use of the river. So shipping occurring at night when there are no swimmers in the water, for example, is really exceptional. It has really model character for other places and for the concept of how to live with port and cities together. So to get this argument out, I've shown you our icons. So we've been working with these icons to capture the different interests and to disentangle what is going on. And you see in many European cities, at least, as people return to the water, they need a new understanding of what shipping actually is, because people will be going with their kayaks and subs, etc., in front of big ships, and that's not safe. And so we have to come up with very specific rules, guidelines on how to engage in novel ways on the water. And to do this, we've been working with stakeholder maps, but stakeholder maps in a slightly different way. So rather than saying who are all the relevant partners on the business level, this includes also advocacy groups, cultural practitioners, or activist groups. So, and here again, we can say each of them has a different idea of what water is for them. The goal of this discussion would be to say we live in a single landscape where there's only one water, and yet we think of water in multiple different ways and we interpret it, we put it together in different ways. So places where we want to have drinking water, we may not want the sewage, and so that we actually rethink water not just as a natural hydrocycle, but even as a cultural hydrocycle. So we've been using this approach and calling it like a value case approach, saying that we need to go beyond a pure business case approach and actually think of shared values and the ways we can bring them together for long-term, more adaptive futures. So, and we've been playing around now with this kind of water values, and I've been using it in my research for the Seine, talking notably about these 4 values: swimming, sewage, shipping, and safety. And the question, what does this mean for heritage and the preservation of historic buildings and sites? Because, and on the one hand, we can learn from history and heritage in interesting ways. Heritage is something we have decided to protect. In the case of Paris, the city government managed to set up first something called Paris Beach, where people had, where they took out in the months of August the highways from the center of Paris and put sand in there so that people could in the city enjoy as if they were on a beach. With that, they built a whole narrative. Remember what I talked about in the beginning of what are the imaginaries of the shipping spaces. They reversed this and brought people back, arguing also that the fact of having a World Heritage Site was needed and was helpful to actually build this new story about Paris and to kick the traffic out. So in the last 10, 15 years, Paris has extremely transformed, much less traffic, much more bikes. And having lived in Paris for some time, I would have really not even imagined that that would have been possible. So what is happening, and then all of this leading up to the Olympics and beyond the Olympics into new ways of living with water in Paris, in the Seine. Now, the questions that this raises, you may think, yes, but what happens in the surrounding areas? What happens in cities like Le Havre at the bottom of the river? All of these questions need to be asked, and they need to be identified in terms of how has this historically developed? And what does it then mean for future connections? So I'm still talking a lot, I'm talking primarily about Europe, but I do think that there are elements that can be inspirational also for Mexico and for other places in the world. We have recently set up a network of people who are working on port city territories in Europe with a couple of pilots. So you can, if you like, you can look it up. It's called a Cost Action Pact, Port City Territories in Action, where we are looking into the ways of what does the energy transition in ports as well in cities mean for the citizens. So how do we actually create inclusive approaches? Interestingly, the city of Limassol in Cyprus has done that very well. I think they have launched a survey already 5 years ago in which they asked citizens what they saw, how they engaged with water. The reason for such an approach is also to say Limassol is a tourist place. They want their land values to remain the same. They have to protect the water so that the swimmers will actually come. But if the boats or the yachts pollute the water, the swimmers will no longer come. They risk dropping land values. So they have been very openly addressing this kind of question. Let me show you a few more things and then I'll stop and open it up for questions. With all of this in mind, we've been developing also several open access courses. I've been teaching with Sabat. We have a course, but we also have now a workshop coming up in the Netherlands to look directly into what are cities like Rotterdam, The Hague, Amsterdam doing. Because like the examples I gave for Paris, I think that these cities have a different approach. So for example, how do we keep port activities alive in the city while urban functions are moving in? We do not want necessarily just a hotel, high-rise, high-end housing next to a port if the sound and the pollution, etc., continue to exist. And remember what I showed you in the beginning, how maritime pollution, industrial pollution actually engages the entire territory. So if you're interested in this value case approach, then well, by all means, send me an email. So I was also mentioning these kind of open access courses that we've been developing with similar goals. Now, we've been using these ideas to get our students to play with it and work with it. And these projects by students can be much more volatile, I was going to say, much more imaginary. But I think it's important to get architects and planners to also think about what ports actually are and how port city territories work. Most of the time when I talk to my students in the beginning and I talk about ports, they just say, oh, well, that's an extension place for new housing. No, it's not. Ports are needed. They are the drivers. They are the heart blood of many of the cities that have grown. And these ports will continue to exist even as they evolve and change. So architects, planners at the same time have to understand the role of the ports. They have to understand what water is about, particularly in a time of climate change, where water conditions will change, where sea level rises, where we are going towards more nature-based solutions. And I'm showing you this example from Naples, because it was started by an argument from the port and the city. So you can recognize the Vesuvio in the back. The idea here was that there was an oil refinery in the hinterland shutting down. The city wanted to reconnect across the oil refinery so that there was an urban continuity. The port's infrastructure cut across the site, and they wanted to have it as an inland part. So in that discussion, the city given that the city wanted this connection, the only escape, you could say, for the port was then to say we build a new container platform in front of the World Heritage Site in the sea. So that kind of relationship, and students would come up with these kinds of ideas of floating ports and changing coastlines. And sometimes their ideas are really very visionary. And you might not think that this is going to happen, but I do think there's a certain power in architecture and planning of imagining even, let's say, very crazy futures, but ones that will get us into discussion. What is it that we actually want in the long term? How do we have to align the values of locals, of ports, of cities, of activists to develop a more inclusive, green, sustainable future for port city territories? So to conclude, I would say it's about rethinking scales, rethinking time, and really spelling out the values that we want to achieve with these kinds of developments in port city territories, acknowledging that these are very unique, special places. I'll stop here. Thank you.